often have you felt restricted to spiritual practices that often seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants. In today's episode, I will be in conversation with Ragan Sutterfield, author of Watch and Wonder, Birding as a Spiritual Practice. I'm not a birder, but I found Ragan Sutterfield's insights both as a birder and as an Episcopal priest inspired me to take more notice not just of the birds, but of the whole of creation and the beauty of the environment around me. Ragan serves as a parish priest in his native Arkansas, where he seeks to live the good life with his wife, Emily, and their two daughters, Lillian and Lucia, on a small homestead. Well, Ragan, it's very good to finally meet you, even if it is only over an internet connection like this. And I am just thoroughly enjoying your book, Watch and Wonder. And it really is helping me to notice the birds and everything around me in a new way. So thank you for writing this. I think it's wonderful. And
well, thank you,
much
Christine.
to my, you're welcome. Yeah. But before we get into that, I want you to tell me a little bit more about yourself, because you're not just a birder. And I'm using the word birder because I understand that birding is not just about looking at birds, but
Yes.
It's far more to that. And we'll get into that in a moment. But give us a little more of your background.
Sure. So I am a native Arkansan here in the southern United States, and I am an Episcopal priest, and so serve a congregation as an associate priest there here in Little Rock, Arkansas, where I was born. So I've got deep roots here, and that may get a little bit into the story because I've been also watching the birds in this place for a very long time. And I'm married to Emily and have two daughters who are teenagers, Lily and Lucia. And we live on a small, we call it an urban homestead, where we try to offer hospitality to wild and domestic neighbors alike. And
Wonderful.
and so my work over the years, as someone who found a lot of interest in wild things early on, as I look back over the things that I've written throughout my life, because I'm also a writer, it always turns back in some way or another to the intersection of our lives as human beings and the life of the whole of creation. So I've written on everything from soil to the role of the body to exploring the life of Wendell Berry, who's been a very important figure for me in understanding these connections. And then this most recent book, Watch and Wonder, which really gets back all the way to my roots of when I first started really opening up to the wild world in a more specific way when I started bird watching as a young person.
Wonderful. Well, I must confess that this has made me want to get hold of some of your other books as well. So I will probably be doing that in the future. But at the moment, I've got a pile of books about not 3 feet high. Maybe getting close. Quite a pile of books that I'll need to get through before I add any others to the list, unfortunately.
I understand the problem. I have a pile like that too.
I can imagine just the number of references you make to books that you've read gives me that impression. It really has opened me up to the birds around me in a new way because, to be honest, I think because I grew up in Australia where the birds are all big and bright and very raucous quite often, I didn't really appreciate it. The small birds of the Pacific Northwest, which is where I now live, um, and tended to dismiss them because they were not just tiny, but many of them looked drab to me,
Hmm.
and I didn't appreciate the uniqueness of them. So I have really kind of zeroed in a little bit more on that, and particularly as the summer comes and the hummingbirds, like
Oh, yes.
yesterday afternoon, for example, there was a hummingbird. It seemed to me just dancing with joy in one of the little fountains that I have out, um, that goes just does this nice little spray of water. And it was absolutely loving that. And so I sat and watched that for about 15 minutes. It was just so delightful. But I was wondering, I know that this passion goes way back for you. How did it get started? Is it something you feel is part of your DNA, or what was it about birding that really attracted you?
So I am someone who grew up in with a love for the outdoors that I
Mhm.
really inherited, especially from my father, who was a big canoeer and was a Christian camp director for all of my growing up years. So I
Mm.
grew up in that context of living in places that most people go to for vacation, but I was there all year round and had expansive fields and forest to explore on my own and have those encounters with nature that I think so many children have lost now, but
Yeah.
those encounters that really tuned me into the natural world in a different way. But birds for me actually started for a period of our life when my father was transitioning from one camp to another, and he was working on actually establishing and building a new camp. So for this few years, we were living in a suburb, and it was a little bit of a hard transition for us. But thankfully, my parents found a house for us where we had this undeveloped lot right behind the house, and so it was a little wooded
Mm.
patch, and so I was still able to have a place where I could go and explore the natural world, even though we were living in a suburban area of Little Rock, Arkansas. But it was there that we set up a bird feeder, and I started to wonder what are these different birds that are coming to the feeder and trying to identify them. And um, we had a World Book Encyclopedia. Some of our younger listeners may not even know what that that is, but we had a set of World Book encyclopedias, and there was the bird section, and they had on that bird section there was a plate with all of the different common birds that might be in a place in North America. And so I started trying to identify the things that were coming to the feeder. And pretty soon I exhausted that bird plate from the encyclopedia, and there were birds coming that weren't on that plate. And so thankfully, I met a woman up the street from me who was a fairly serious backyard birder, and she had field guides and introduced me to the idea of a
Ah.
field guide. And so I got my own copy and um, just started working on identifying the birds that were coming to the feeder, and then started going to local parks and looking at the birds there, and found out about our local Audubon Society that hosted field trips, and that's it. Just really took off from there, and was taken. Had mentors who were very experienced in birding in the area, and were glad to show a eager preteen to what birds were around, and so because so many of them had actually started at that same age, and so that was a really important part of my growing up, just not only in birding, but also having other adults in my life that were showing me the world in different ways.
Mm. Well, I must say one of the things that interested me, that I thought, "Oh, I've got to get one of those," is the birding apps you talk about.
Yes.
Because of course, I mean, I have an app for recognizing rocks, and I have an app for recognizing plants, but I don't have an app for recognizing birds. So tell us a little bit about that, because it is something that I thought, "Oh, this would be a really good way to kind of increase that interest."
Yes. So there's so many tools available now that I just didn't have access to when I was first learning about birds. But the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is really the one of the foremost bird organizations in the world. It's based at Cornell University, and they do have graduate students working on PhDs there. But they also provide so much more, and they have two really important apps. One is the Merlin app, and that is an app to help you identify birds. And so it can both help you through a process of elimination identify a bird that you've seen. So they have some questions that they lead you through of kind of what shape was the bird, what size was the bird, what was the basic color. And it's important always to use that app with the location services on, because it will narrow down to birds that might be likely in your area.
Uh-huh.
And they actually have it, for it's global now, so they
Wonderful.
have resources for all over the world. And um, so it also has an app, a part of that app that can listen to birds and can suggest what might be around that it's hearing. And I say suggested because it's important to know that it's not foolproof, and sometimes it
Mhm.
makes mistakes. And so it's always important to sort of track down the bird and see if it's right or not. I think more experienced birders often are skeptical of some of the suggestions that it gives. So you need to approach with caution, but it really is, especially for the common species, very very, useful and
Mm.
in a good way in. Because when I was first learning bird songs, we had to listen to CDs and
I even
listen over
have
and over.
one of those way back, but I just couldn't get into it because listening to a CD just, it was like, no, this
Yeah,
is not my way of doing it.
no, it's hard to do. And what's nice about Merlin is it will suggest the bird, and then you can press on it and it will play back the song to you, and you can say like, "Oh, that's
Ah.
that's what I'm
Mhm.
hearing." Okay. And so that can be really useful.
Mm. Fascinating. I just, the modern tools, some of them I wish we didn't have, but others I think can really enhance our understanding of God's world in wonderful ways, I think.
Yes.
Um, which starts to get us into a into your book, really. And just something that you talk about. The birding seems to me to provide an opening into a big world of exploration, of companionship. One of the things that fascinated me, of course, was that this is not something that you usually do on your own, that you so often go out with a group of people and sometimes connecting to people literally all over the country or sometimes all over the world. So there's that sense of companionship in it, as well as of recognition that we are just small cogs in a world of wonder and beauty. Um, and it's obviously changed the way that you look at the world. And what would you say are, in a nutshell, the most important lessons that you've learned from birding?
A nutshell's hard, but
I know, that's why I said that, because you could probably go on for hours just talking about that.
well, a couple of things that I'll say is, as you said, I think that birding can offer an opening, because birds are, even those more drab species like you're experiencing in the Pacific Northwest, as compared to your native Australian birds, which I've seen some of those birds, and they are really amazing and beautiful and flashy. And
Mhm.
um, but just paying attention to birds, which are, they're of the vertebrate species, birds and fish are the most varied,
Mhm.
on Earth. And of course, most of us don't really see all the fish all that often unless we go snorkeling or diving. And so
Well,
birds,
snorkeling on
though,
the Great Barrier Reef, I tell
oh,
you, is
it's amazing.
amazing. Yes.
Yes, yes, I had the fortune to do
Sorry,
that
I
one time.
interrupted you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
So you can think about all the amazing variety of fish there, but birds are this vertebrate species that's around us all the time. I mean, you can't walk outside without encountering a bird, and they are also, have all of these different habitats and habits. And so when you start to tune into that, it's a sort of opening into this wider world that goes beyond birds. So,
Mhm.
I started off as someone who was very interested in birds, but if you're interested in birds, then you have to start to get interested a little bit, at least, in insects, because birds, of course, rely on insects, and different kinds of insects can clue you in about different aspects of birds. Um, and then you also have to pay attention to plants and trees, and so it's this sort of path into this vast world of variety and abundance that
Mhm.
God has made and that we get to experience. And birds for me have been a particular window into that. So I talk about them as being a kind of icon,
Mhm.
um, because a good icon is something that we don't just see the beautiful thing and stop our vision there, but instead the icon invites us to look beyond it into the wider world. And so
Yes.
that's part of what birding has done for me. So I'll stop there, but
No,
that's
that's
I think
wonderful.
one of the central things that the
Mhm.
birding's offered me.
Oh, it's a wonderful, I hadn't, and I remember reading that in your book and thinking, wow, and then realizing how that is true in so many ways. And actually, I think that one book that really helped me think about birds in a different way was reading Mark Wallace's book, When God Was a Bird.
Oh
I don't know if
yes,
you've
yes.
read that, but it's fascinating because we don't tend to think of birds as part of who God is. But I
Yeah.
think when we start to think of the fact that, you know, the Holy Spirit is often represented as a bird, and Mark's thesis is that that is because this is the representation of God in the creaturely world. Um,
Yes.
and to me, that expands that understanding of how not only phenomenal birds are, but how much we need to be aware of them and working on conserving them as well, I think.
Yes, well, that's a great book to mention. And I once was writing a sermon on the baptism of Jesus, where the dove comes down, and went down a rabbit trail of trying to look at the different dove species that were in the Middle East at that time, and exploring what kind of dove that would have been,
Mhm, mhm.
perhaps.
Yeah, and it expands our understanding of the story, I think, when we do that kind of research as well. I think it's important. Um, in the introduction to Watch and Wonder, you say one of the formative realities of birding is the way it helps us inhabit time. Paying attention to birds puts us in contact with the season in a world where so much of life is disconnected from natural rhythms. Um, a great comment, I thought, and very profound, and because setting the groundwork for your formatting of the book as walking through the months of the year. Um, and so explain a little more about how you feel that birds help us inhabit time and why you chose this kind of a format.
Sure. So, you know, one of the questions if you're trying to write a book is always just how do you structure this thing so that
Yes.
people can follow along, um and I think as I was working on that, the idea of a birder's year really made sense, because there are very distinct things that I'm doing every month of the year that change as I'm encountering birds in different ways. So, December is always the highlight. The pinnacle of December for me in my birding life is the Christmas bird count, and so
Mm.
that chapter is centered there. In January, there's this. Um, there are all kinds of variety of interesting birds that show up in Arkansas in January, because we're fairly far south, and birds are not nesting at that time in the global north. So that so they are wandering sometimes where they're not normally found. So there's always interesting rare birds that are found in January. Um, and so it was just natural to follow that pattern, but also to when you start cluing into the ways that birds change their patterns over a year's time, you start to recognize the intricate ways in which they are tied into the larger ecosystems that they
Mm,
inhabit. So I was recently camping with my family on the coast of Alabama, and that's a place where a lot of birds that are migrating over the Gulf, they land on this barrier island just before they come to the mainland, and so it's the first land that they see after this big traversing of the Gulf. And one night we were walking out towards the beach, and all of a sudden there were just insects everywhere. And it was a little bit annoying to us. They weren't biting insects, but they were just landing on us, and they were some sort of lacewing. I'm not sure exactly what species of insect they were, but they were everywhere. But at the same time, there were all of these common nighthawks that are um, they feed on insects at night and fly around. They've got big mouths, and they just fly through clouds of insects and gobble them up. And they're migratory birds. So they had just arrived probably from traversing the Gulf of Mexico, and they're having a great time with all of these insects. It was just for that one night that all of these insects came out. Um, but mulberry trees are also have lots of fruit at this time of year. So a lot of the fruit eating birds are feeding on those mulberries, but that's timed to their migration so that they're able to get the energy that they need to get up to their nesting grounds. And then those nesting grounds themselves, it also coincides with the abundance of insects that
mm.
the birds. Most of our bird species need insects to feed their young, even if the adult birds eat mostly seeds. And so, just those ways that they are very deeply tied in, not only to weather patterns and those kinds of changings of the seasons and plant life, but also to the hatching of particular insects and
Mm.
all of those intricate patterns are really a part of birds' lives. And when we start to pay attention to those, then they begin to be part of our lives as well.
Well, it's interesting because for the first time ever, um, I watched the migrations, on Facebook because, they were constantly posting. And I could be wrong, but I don't think that most of the Australian birds migrate in that way. In fact, the main migration I know about is the rare migration when the inland lake, um, and my apologies because I cannot remember the Aboriginal name for it, but Lake Eyre, which has filled up 4 times in the last century, and the birds migrate. It's just fascinating. The pelicans that normally live on the coast, they migrate to Lake Eyre. Birds as far away as Japan and Russia migrate to Lake Eyre for breeding, for all kinds of things. But it's a different kind of migration.
Yeah.
Um, Fascinating, though, to look at these migration patterns and what they can tell us about, you know, different kinds of creatures around the place. It's quite
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yes, and they're often tied to different seasons of abundance. So I'm sure that
Mhm.
like there are these particular probably times when it has a lot of food available, and so
That's
birds
part
are,
of
are
it,
coming.
yeah. The little shrimp that have kind of laid there for years suddenly hatch, and it's like it is, it's amazing. So hundreds of thousands of birds can gather on these lakes, and I do know that, there are a couple of species for whom their very survival depends on these, occasions. But it's not like here where you get the yearly patterns of migration. So it's fascinating, and just what we can learn from even looking into this little kind of snapshot of
Yes,
birds, I think is fascinating too. Um,
yes,
but then I wasn't going to bring this up, but uh, the other thing I learned about for the first time this year is how many birds are killed by running into the windows of tall buildings on their
yes.
migrations. Particularly Chicago, I understand, is one of the absolute death traps.
That yes, there have been some really terrible events in Chicago, particularly McCormick Place, which is a big convention center that's
Mhm.
right by the lake, and so a lot of the migrating birds, follow the the edge of Lake Michigan, and there's this big McCormick place that has these windows. And one of the problems is that it's the tall buildings are a problem, but it's also when they have lights on at night that
Hmm.
the birds can see. It's very confusing and disorienting to them because many of them are, navigating with starlight, and so a tall building with lights on is really deadly for birds. And so many cities have worked to, or activists have worked to get cities to have lights out nights when you can, they now with radar can tell when there are going to be big migration nights, and to say, okay, tonight building managers turn off the lights, don't, so that they don't interfere with bird migration.
Because I think it's millions of birds that have
Oh yes,
died.
yes. It
Yeah.
yeah, that you know, outside of big causes like habitat destruction, um, window strikes are one of the leading causes of bird deaths in the world, and they're very consequential. It is millions of them, and it causes serious problems for migrating birds, and
Mm.
so. And it's something that could be addressed. It's not just the presence of the buildings; it's also those lighting policies that could be, doesn't take much to turn off the lights, but people have to be paying attention and do that. But then also, proper window treatments for there are ways to design glass that birds can see it and
Mhm.
don't see the reflection. Um, and so there's a need for more and more windows to be treated with those treatments, or installed. There are glass companies that are now installing bird-friendly windows, to begin with, so that's
Well, and
important
I
as well.
I think I read that the McCormick Building in Chicago has just uh, done some things to. I don't know whether they changed the glass or what they did, but I read that they have actually finally, I think, just this last year or so, done something.
Yes, I think last year there was a really terrible night where, tens of thousands of birds died, and, there was a lot of news about it and a lot of media, and so I think that was enough to get them to make some changes.
But it's tragic, of course, that
It
that's what
is,
it
yeah,
takes, isn't it? Yeah.
it is.
Well, let's get into your book a little bit. I do want to just highlight actually three of the months: May, which is listening; June, which is grief; and July, which is beauty. I just wanted to look at those because in the chapter on listening, you talk about how birding provides an opening towards listening, a habit that provides the skills for everything from hearing good music to paying attention to a conversation. In other words, it helps us focus. And I really liked that understanding that as a spiritual practice, birding can really help us listen to other aspects of life. Can you tell us a little more about that and excuse me, and just the lessons that you feel that it holds for us in terms of our spiritual lives?
Sure, yes. So you mentioned earlier that this term birding or birder, and, you know, in the process of publishing a book, as you know, there's always some back and forth with the publisher about like the title of the book, and um, of course, watch is part of the title, but we when we were talking about the subtitle, that the publisher was like bird watching as a spiritual practice. I was like, no, 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 it needs to be birding because it's so much more than just watching, and we already have watch in the title, so that's enough. But um, and I think, the idea of watch can be much broader than just visual, um, but birding really is a way of tuning into the world, and I think that's an essential part of listening, that we so often go around, and particularly those of us who live in places that are cities or have a lot of noise in the background, um, where we want to block everything out,
Hmm.
because sometimes it can just get too overwhelming to have all of that noise. And so we start to do that, and we get in a habit of blocking out the background noise of the world around us. But part of the damage that that does is that it also tunes us out of the life that's around us and the lives that are sharing this world with us. And so part of what birding has done for me is to help me to tune into these creatures that are sharing my place wherever I might be. And so when I walk out in the morning and I hear, this morning I was sitting on my front porch and I heard a catbird, and I was pointing it out to my wife, and then there goes the bird. It flies by, and it makes this kind of meowing sound that sounds a lot like a cat. So
Mm.
that's why it's called a catbird, a gray catbird. And so um, I'm suddenly aware of the presence of this creature that's in my place for a little while, and catbirds mostly are migratory where I live. So so this bird was likely just passing through, but I'm getting this one glimpse into the to its world, and it's sharing my world. And I think that that can open us up to then also paying attention to the other kinds of things that are going on around us. And um, it can be hard sometimes because when you start to tune in, you are you don't have that filter and that blocking out anymore. Um, but I think that the gifts are certainly more than the negatives of that. That there's so much that we can pay attention to in new ways if we really open up our listening. And birds are, again, a kind of, I'm not a great musician. I enjoy listening to music. I don't understand all of the intricacies of it, like a real musician does. But I've loved hearing concerts with people who really know what they're listening to and can kind of point those things out. I lived in Chicago for a while, so I went to some jazz venues with some friends who really knew jazz, and to sort of get to listen in with them, it provides a new appreciation. And um, and so I hope that when I'm going out with my friends or my family and pointing out the birds around, that it can have that same kind of effect.
Mm. Well, it's interesting. I was thinking as you were speaking, um, this is like learning to listen beyond the noise. Um, and I was thinking about that this morning. I had an MRI on my foot.
Mm,
And, MRIs are very noisy. And so, and as I lay there, I thought, can I listen beyond the noise to hear the voice of God?
mm.
And, it's the same kind of thing of how do we listen beyond the noise to hear, and in some ways, the voices of God that come through birds and through other parts of God's creation, instead of the city noise that, yes, we want to block it out and sometimes need to block it out, but we do often block everything out in the process. So it was an interesting little experience I found there.
I really like that, and I talk about in the book how I think prayer can, active times of prayer can be like active times of birding that help us tune in, and then we carry that with us into the
Mhm.
rest of our days and the rest of our life, where we can, I'm usually not actively birding, but I'm always hearing what's around. And in the
Yes.
same way that I'm not, sitting at my prayer desk and actively praying, I'm still aware of the presence of God when I'm
Mhm,
when I'm out in the world. But I wouldn't have that awareness without those active times of
mhm.
really tuning in.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, then the next chapter, June, you talk about grief. And, I suppose this really hit me because of the fact that, I'm going through the grief with my husband's dementia at the moment.
Mm,
Um, and, but the thing that uh, really hit me was when you talk about listening to the ghost birds. Um, and it was a powerful thing, and how, in a way, what I was thinking is we need to, what I got out of it is we need to learn to listen to kind of the memories of things that were, which is what a ghost bird is in a way. But tell us a little about what is listening to ghost birds about,
Sure.
and why do you think it matters?
So I had this experience where I was at a gathering of the Ecclesia Project, which is an organization I've been involved with for a long while, and we always have a theme for our gatherings, and this particular theme was grief, and specifically ecological grief, and so we had invited in Hannah Malcolm, who's a really wonderful English priest and theologian who's written beautifully on ecological grief. But then also we had an artist for the event, Patricia Fong, and she invited us to take our grief, and she had this exercise that she led us through where we took strips of cloth and did this weaving exercise together where we wrote things that we were grieving and wove those
Mm,
together and then into a grief braid that we joined
mm,
as part of our altar. Um, and while we were doing that exercise, she played the sounds of ghost birds for us
mm.
in the
Wow.
background. And so she had recordings of ivory-billed woodpeckers or Bachman's warblers or um, these various species that we have lost now. Some of the honey creepers from Hawaii, and um, so there's so many species, birds and otherwise, that have gone extinct. And thankfully, we do have recordings of some of them. And so in the book, I talk about the experience of going through a landscape and imagining that absence where, I was this traces a breeding bird survey that I do every June. And so in the chapter, I sort of followed the narrative of doing that, conducting that breeding bird survey. But I'm passing by these areas where I know that over a century ago, there were Bachman's warblers there
Mm,
and likely ivory-billed woodpeckers there as well. Those were species that would have been present, but I can't hear them anymore,
mm,
except as this sort of trace on the landscape that I know was there. And so that that presence and absence, I think, is part of what grief is about. That um, it's it's an absence that we are aware is there. It's not something that's just forgotten, but we part of what grief is holding the presence of that absence, in um, and that's something that experience of listening in those particular places brought for me.
mm. Well, and you also talk about how we only grieve what we love,
Yes.
and when we don't notice things around us, of course, we don't love them and we don't grieve them at all. And how small our worlds have become in a lot of ways in terms of what we love. I think, very focused on family, very focused on our own possessions and things like that. So we in many ways, our modern society encourages us to not love the world around us, to but we need to expand our vision. And I think birding is one of the ways that this is probably possible because you talk about learning to practice grief as part of the work of love. I thought that was a
Yeah.
great comment as well. Um, and certainly something that we all need to do, I think.
Yes. Yes. And this comes some from my reading of Wendell Berry and the idea that if we, he has a great essay called It All Turns on Affection. And it's love for particular places, particular creatures that does drive our acts of care. And if we don't have deep connections to the particular places and creatures, then we won't really know how to love properly. We
Mm,
know that love is always concrete and particular. Um, there's an essayist, Charles D'Ambrosio, who has a great essay collection called Loitering. And in that collection, he has this one line where he says, "Abstract love is one step away from abstract hate."
Oh,
Um, and I love that because I think it's true. And
mhm,
so part of what paying attention to birds has done for me is to give me a particular and concrete love for species and places where they live. And so, as an example, recently there's Google is trying to build an AI data center on a wetland, what in a place that I birdwatch quite a bit, and it's there's been a lot of opposition and outcry from the public in general, but particularly from the birding community,
mm,
because we all know this place. We
mhm,
know the creatures that live there that will lose their life and livelihood if this data center is allowed to go forward. And so we're fighting as best we can against a $1 trillion company um, to save this particular place. And I wrote a little piece for our local newspaper about it, and I think part of what helped it resonated well with a lot of people, and part of that was, I went to the place and I talked about all of the birds that I saw there
mm.
and described their beauty and the creatures that would no longer have a home if this AI data center is allowed to go in. And so that's all still in process. So we'll see how it goes. But um, I hear about there are all kinds of data centers and things going on other places, and that's for
Well,
other people to
there's the
to work
same
on.
thing going on here in Washington State as well. But
Yeah.
I think the whole thing of changing people's perspectives of what, why is this important? You have to change people's perspectives. I think of Robert McFarlane's um, books, Landfall. Is it Landfall? I think I've got that wrong. Anyway, where he talks about how one of the Scottish islands, they where people thought it was just nothing, and they worked hard to find the history and the poems and the wildlife and things, so that they totally changed people's perspectives, so that not a solar farm, a wind farm did not get
Mhm.
built on the area. And that's what we need to do, is change people's perspectives. Um, I think of David Attenborough and how much he has done to help
Yes.
change people's perspectives. But we all need to do that, I think, in a small way, um, to preserve what needs to be preserved. Um, so I'm so
Yes.
glad that you're involved in that fight. And then the following chapter was the chapter on beauty, which of course is close to my heart because, I'm increasingly convinced that at the core, as creators, we are meant to create beauty.
Mm.
Um, and that's one of the main purposes, to create and to appreciate beauty in its many different um, ways. But one of the sentences that really struck me was, the pleasure of beauty is based upon participation rather than possession. And of
Mm.
course, we live in a culture that places focus on possession rather than participation. So, what does this really mean to you? And again, why do you think it matters?
Yes. So that idea, if when you're writing, you always discover ideas and things that, um, and so when I was working on this book, I there's an earlier chapter on abundance, and
Mhm.
I when I was thinking about the kinds of abundance that I think birds draw us into versus the kind of abundance that we think about sometimes in our economic lives, um, I came across that idea of just that the abundance that we are invited into in creation is one where we participate in this larger reality. But the abundance that possession calls us toward is just a separation, and we possess these small things, but really it's a meager thing that we own. And I think that's really what Jesus in the Gospels is calling us toward as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that the Jesus is calling us towards participating in the kingdom of God, in this reign of abundance that God has for us. And so when Jesus points to the birds of the air as opposed to those who are storing up in barns, he's saying, let's participate in this world. And I've been reading some writings from Clarence Jordan about the Sermon on the Mount, and Clarence Jordan says that who started the Koinonia community in Georgia. He says that what to have that kind of abundance, we have to have a different kind of community and a different kind of life that where we rely on one another in new ways, and that's the kind of economic abundance. But thinking about that participation versus possession in terms of beauty is the same. So often we see something beautiful and we want to have it for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's this acquisitive, part of ourselves as human beings that's the case. But um, but then when we can let go of that and learn to open ourselves up to the beauty that we just receive as a gift, and then we can live into this more participatory way of being. Because reading some anthropology on gift cultures, you know, the anthropologists say that one of the key things of the gift is that it has to keep on moving, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not for us to hold on to; it's for us to share and pass along to others.
Mm-hmm. As you were talking, what I was thinking about is the analogy I use would be gardening, of course. And, I can walk around the neighborhood and think, oh, I want that plant and I want that plant. But learning to appreciate it in its place is a big part. And then also sharing. And, that participation you don't get the full satisfaction, at least for me, of gardening unless I'm able to share it, share plants, share flowers, share produce. And there's something about sharing that kind of changes our whole way of looking at the world too, so that we're not wanting to be possessive, but we want to be participatory, as you were saying. So um, you've got a whole lot of new thoughts running around in my mind as we talk about this. But, there is so much more in your book that I could talk about or want to talk about. But what I'd like to finish with here is, I'm sure you've been learning a lot more things since you finished this book, because your faith is constantly changing, as is shown through so many of the lessons that you talk about. But is there one thing that you have learned since you wrote this book that you would like to share with us?
I think that's of course there's so many things, so it's hard to narrow down. But I had a similar question from when I was doing a reading recently of like, what if I had to add a chapter to the book, what would I add? And I think that's something that I've been learning and trying to pick up on is the ways in which birds invite us into marginal places. And I touch on
Mm.
this a little bit in the book, but um, it's something that I'm thinking more about lately. And I think there's probably a whole another chapter to write on that. But
Maybe another book.
sure. Um, birds are able to make a life often in places that are, it could be just a strip of habitat here or there. But they're still seeking to make a life, and I think that um, there are ways in which, because of our politics and the way that our world is going, that we need more life from the margins,
Mm.
and to cultivate and find that life. The birds are doing it, but I think that we could do it as well. Of where are those places that no one's really paying attention to, that are maybe it's just a ditch someplace, or an edge of a city, or of a or an abandoned neighborhood, where new life could be brought in, because there's space available there.
Mm.
And that's something that I've thought about in different ways over the years, but I've really been thinking about it. Um, you know, I- I've thought about the margins more as a negative space in the past. Like, we're called as Christians to go to the margins and be with the marginalized, um, and that's all good. But to see that the margins are also this place where there's an opportunity for life, where life
Mm.
has been excluded, in all of the other spaces. And I think that's something that the birds can have clued me in on, and I want to explore what does that mean for discipleship as well.
I love that. What a lovely note to end on, actually. Um, as you know, part of my passion is the homecoming of God, and how do we create a place where God once more wants to abide. And I think of
Yes.
that making life in the margins is a key to that, and so I think part of what you were doing is very much expanding that sense of places that God would like to come home to here on this
Yes.
earth. Um, so thank you so much for this. I really would heartily recommend your book, Watch and Wonder, Birding as a Spiritual Practice, to everybody, not just people who are birders, because I am certainly not a birder, but it's inspired me in so many ways in terms of my faith. So I do hope that people will pick it up and that they will pass it on to their friends as well. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this interview.
Well, thank you, Christine. It's been really good to be with you.
In today's conversation with Ragan Sutterfield, we learnt that birding is far more than a pastime. It's a pathway to understanding our place in God's beautiful world. Ragan's experiences illustrate how connecting with birds can lead to deeper insights about creation and our role within it. I hope it inspires you to embark on your own birding journey. And as you do so, remember to embrace the beauty around you and allow it to inspire a greater appreciation for the natural world and for the God who created it. In the next episode, I will be in conversation with Tim Sorens, co-founder and director of the Parish Collective, a growing network and global movement of Christians connected to being the church in the neighborhood. His latest book is called Everywhere You Look, Discovering the Church Right Where You Are. He also co-authored the book The New Parish, How Neighborhood Churches Transform Mission, Discipleship and Community, which won several awards, including Christianity Today's Award of Merit. I am Christine Sine, author, liturgist, keen gardener, and retired physician. My recent books include Celtic Advent, Following an Unfamiliar Path, and The Gift of Wonder. I write regularly on Substack and conduct workshops and retreats about spiritual practices, Celtic Christianity, and the spirituality of gardening. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the podcast. Please also share it with your friends or join me on Substack, Instagram, or Facebook.